Thank you so Thank you so much to Beth for being here. We'll get started shortly. In the meantime, like I said, go ahead and introduce yourselves by typing in the chat. You can share your name and where you're joining from today. I am Rabbi Melissa Hoffman, Executive Director of Center for Jewish Food Ethics, or CJFE. CJFE is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Jewish communities align their food choices with their Jewish values. And before we get started, a few things that will help us during the program today. Number one, if you would like to turn on your closed captions, these are controlled by you in your own Zoom toolbar by hitting the CC button at the bottom of your window, and you can turn them on and off at any time. Number two, when you sign out of the program, even if it's in the middle, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. We encourage you to fill it out, even if you can't stay for the full time, or you can do so if you save it and want to do so after you watch the rest of it on a recording. We would really appreciate your feedback. So thank you in advance for filling that out. And number three, our program will consist of a short opening talk from Beth, a conversation with the author, and then a moderated Q&A with you. So you are welcome to submit questions into the chat that we can select from. And Professor Berkowitz will gladly take questions relating to the book, even if you haven't read it yet. We hope you do. Also, the research and writing process behind the book and related experiences. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Beth Berkowitz, who is a professor of religion and chair of Jewish studies at Barnard College. Her areas of academic interests are animal studies, Jewish difference, rabbinic legal authority, and Bible reception history. She is the author of Execution and Invention, Death Penalty Discourse in Early Rabbinic and Christian Cultures, Defining Jewish Difference from Antiquity to the Present, Animals and Animality in the Babylonian Talmud, and What Animals Teach Us About Families, Kinship and Species in the Bible and Rabbinic Literature, which just came out. She is also co-editor of Religious Studies of Rabbinic and Rabbinics, A Conversation. And it's my pleasure now to turn it over to Beth.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. I have a bit of a cold. I'm so pleased to be here with you today with the Center for Jewish Food Ethics to share some of my work about animals in Jewish traditions. And here, I'm just going to share a screen because I have a slideshow for just the first part of this talk. And yeah, let's see, here we go. Okay. And I really just want to thank Rabbi Melissa Hoffman, who extended this invitation to me and has just been such an amazing interlocutor with me about this project. She didn't mention it to you, but she's actually worked with me as a part of the project and is a co-author of the epilogue to this book. So, okay, in short, I have a really simple message. And that message is that family has the power to change the way we relate to animals, and by extension, our eating practices with respect to animals. So my goal in this work is to restore family, the concept of family, to Jewish conversations about animals. And you'll notice that I said restore family to conversations about animals, because family used to be part of the Jewish conversation about animals. If you go back to the Torah and to the Talmud, you will find that they were, in fact, very much concerned about animal families. And that concern, we can talk about this in the Q&A, that concern sort of got obscured. But I am trying to lift it up, and it's the subject of my recent book. So I'm just going to turn to the Bible's 4 laws that feature animal families, since that's really the core subject of the book. So the most famous of them, I think, and also actually the most puzzling, is the prohibition against cooking, boiling a young goat. I say when I teach this material sometimes to students, I'll say boiling a kid in his mother's milk, and students will think I'm talking about actual children. I am talking about actual children, but not human children in his mother's milk. So there's no explanation that accompanies this law. It's repeated verbatim 3 times, different places in the Torah. And in each place, the context doesn't actually offer a lot of clues. Okay, a second biblical law featuring the parent-child relationship among animals is the requirement to keep a newborn animal with the mother for the first week of life. And this law appears twice in the Torah. The first time, actually, in the same part of Exodus where the goat cooking prohibition appears. You can see it says, "You shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats. You shall give me the firstborn among your sons. You shall do the same with your cattle and your flocks. 7 days he shall remain with his mother. On the 8th day, you shall give him to me." So it's a rule dealing with first produce, firstborn human sons, firstborn animals. And the idea here is there shouldn't be any delays in offering first fruits, first produce to God. The passage says, but in the case of animals, and it seems like they may be talking about humans too, you should wait out the firstborn's first week of life. And it's really only on or after the 8th day that a baby can be donated to God, whatever exactly that means. Now, this 7-day rule, you can see, it appears also in Leviticus. It's a somewhat different formulation. And it appears actually with another law about animal families, which is the one I want to present to you next. So the third animal family law is a prohibition against slaughtering, and I think a lot of people don't know about this one, is against slaughtering an animal parent and their child on the same day. So just to read it, an animal from the herd or from the flock, him and his child, I'm translating literally, you'll find out in a minute why, you shall not slaughter on the same day. So that's the big question here. Is Leviticus here maybe innovating by expanding the animal family concern beyond the mother explicitly, which is what we've seen so far, to possibly include the father or even focus on the father, because the Hebrew grammar there is masculine, oto ve'et beno. But there's lots of discussion about this among interpreters from antiquity to today about which gender animal parent this applies to. Okay, let's move on to the fourth law, which is in Deuteronomy, and it's sending off the mother bird. So if along the road you chance upon a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, the mother sitting over the fledglings or on the eggs, do not take the mother with her young. Let the mother go. Take only the young, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. Okay, so when a person happens upon a mother bird, like roosting in her nest, they must not take her together with her chicks or eggs. The person can take the chicks or eggs, but they first have to chase away the mother bird. Now, you may notice here that this law is different. It's actually different in a few ways, but one of those ways is that it's presented with a reward. You chase away the mother bird in order that you may fare well and have a long life. Now, this may sound familiar to you, this reward of prosperity and long life, because it comes up in connection with a much more famous law, which is the 5th of the 10 commandments. Honor your father and your mother as your God has commanded you, that you may have a long life and fare well in the land that your God is assigning to you. So it's interesting, this repetition of the same reward, using the same language, suggests, and I'm not clearly there's sort of a common theme of parent-child too, suggests that honoring the bird's mother um, child relationship secures a good and long life in a similar way that honoring one's own parent does. Okay, so these four laws appear in all the major legal collections in the Bible. Now, this concern about animal families, I find it really interesting. It does not appear in the Code of Hammurabi, on which the earliest biblical law is based, which suggests that actually the Bible may have been the very first legal collection, at least that we know of, to focus on the parent-child relationship among animals, and it is therefore making really a distinctive contribution to the culture of the ancient Near East in its own time. Okay, so the biggest question about these laws is why? What's the thinking behind them? And these laws have really long presented a conundrum to interpreters because each law respects and in a certain way tries to protect the bond between animal parents and children. But at the same time, it completely presumes a violation of that bond through either separation or slaughter. Now, the dominant interpretation of these laws is to see in them what is usually called a humanitarian concern. And the oldest and most complete formulation of that approach comes from the ancient Jewish philosopher Philo. And so here he's interpreting the prohibition against slaughtering an animal, parent and child, on the same day. And he denounces like the gluttony and savagery he sees in somebody who would do this. And he sees here like this ethically problematic mixing of life with death. And in this passage, which I pulled out, which I found to be the most vivid, he conjures up this unnerving image of like severed animal limbs speaking out from the barbecue pit to the person standing there. The mother and child animals are like talking back to the human who's roasting them on the same spit and is objecting to the gross disregard they seem to be showing for their relationship. Okay, so many Jewish commentators, as well as Christian commentators, have gone on to echo Philo's approach in some form or another. We have Rashbam, Rashi's grandson. We have Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed. We have modern Bible scholars. I just have a few examples here. So these approaches all take some concern with humanitarianism, civility, compassion, empathy to be the main motive of these laws. And it really became like the normative approach for Jews and Christians to read these laws this way. But there are big problems with this approach, and I am definitely not the first person to point out these problems. Maimonides, in fact, in a different part of his writings, he actually raises the problem. He says if these laws were an expression of mercy, then God wouldn't have commanded us to slaughter animals or birds at all. Rather, there's just we can't try to find the reason for this law. And then a modern Bible commentator, Jacob Milgram, who's sort of like the primo commentator on Leviticus, he really here lays out kind of point by point why the compassion rationale just doesn't work. Like he says, you can still, like for the prohibition against slaughtering on the same day, like you can kill the mother on Monday and the child on Tuesday. Like, how is that more compassionate? That doesn't seem to be the issue. Or taking a baby from the mother on the 8th day as opposed to the 7th day. Like, why is that? Like, it just seems arbitrary. In terms of boiling a kid in his mother's milk, like what difference does it make to the mother What difference does it make to the child if it's the mother, that mother's milk or water, or roasting them on the spit? In any event, they're both being slaughtered. So if compassion is the rationale for these laws, it seems kind of like an empty performance, maybe even hypocrisy, or just kind of nonsensical. Now, a lot of people have said, like you saw it in Philo a little bit, is the aim of the laws is not to help animals, but it's to help inculcate virtues in humans. But it's a very strange lesson in compassion if the recipient in no way experiences it. So I propose in my book that classical rabbinic literature actually offers a really interesting alternative to understanding these laws. So that is, I'm going to stop my share. And that is what Rabbi Hoffman and I are going to discuss together.
Thank you, Beth. So yeah, that's just a taste. And now we'll get into more of the detail and hopefully highlight some of the complexities of the book that you so adeptly bring out. I want to zoom out for a minute and just talk about what, like, how did you come to be interested in this content? Most of us are probably sitting here thinking, what even is out there at the intersection of Jewish studies or religious studies and animal studies? So what where does this fall within what's already out there, and what kind of gap might it be filling in the academic world?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So let me give a bit of personal background that I think might be helpful, and I'll also talk about the academic scene. So I was a vegetarian since I was 12. For the past 5 years, I've been vegan. And it's always been a really defining part of who I am. I grew up on the Jersey Shore. I don't know if we have anyone here who's from the Jersey Shore. I grew up in like the 70s and the 80s. And now vegetarianism and even veganism is like pretty common. But it wasn't back then. Like it was kind of weird. And my whole family was vegetarian. So we were like a weird family. So it became kind of like a really, like a defining part of my identity, because every time you shop at the grocery store or eat a meal or get hosted for a meal, you have to kind of announce yourself as, or you travel, go to a restaurant, you announce yourself as a vegetarian. So I think that really stood out to me as part of who I am from an early age. Now, as a scholar then of rabbinic literature, I trained to study the Talmud and related works. I was really primed to see the animals in rabbinic literature. But the reality is that people kind of think animals are not a serious subject of analysis. And people just didn't pay attention to the animals in rabbinic literature, which is sort of ironic because they are all over rabbinic literature. But people just didn't ask questions about them, maybe a few exceptions here or there, but it just wasn't something people studied. So that's rabbinics. Now, that's not true in the academy as a whole. So I'd say like in the 80s, kind of jump-started by Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, you get a whole field of study called animal studies. Sometimes they call it critical animal studies, where people start talking about like the question of the animal, which I think refers to just the ways that we humans like divide ourselves from all other species. There's like the human and the animal, and we take this like very diverse animal world and just kind of homogenize it into this binary with humans. So that really started to get questioned in very radical ways. But it didn't really hit my fields of rabbinics or even Jewish studies that much. So I really wanted to change that with some of my work. So my previous book, Animal, you mentioned it in the intro, Animals and Animality in the Babylonian Talmud, I picked out passages in the Talmud which I thought just had mind-blowingly fascinating things to say about animals, and people just hadn't really noticed. So I think a lot of the questions people today are asking about animals, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to actually be an animal as a human? These questions are actually really being raised in classical Jewish sources, but the conversations are really only now just getting jump started, which is pretty exciting. And to me, I kind of connected to gender studies and women's studies, that women were just like, nobody cared about women or other kind of like minoritized people. And then like suddenly people start realizing, oh, like they're there too, and let's think about like the role they're playing and their experience. So I kind of feel like that's where we're at with animal studies.
Yeah, and you raise another important point through the book where we've evolved as a people to also be distanced in certain ways from animals in ways that our ancestors were not. So even though we're reading it, not noticing the animal, we're actually looking at it through a lens of just being at a place in time where we've evolved to distance ourselves from them. And that wasn't necessarily true of the people, the cast of characters within rabbinics, right? But thank you for sharing that. Uh, can you talk about what you found particularly interesting, uncomfortable, or inspiring about any of the I always want to say animal friendly laws, and they're not necessarily
Right. True.
animal
True.
friendly laws. They are
Right.
animal family laws.
Yeah.
So, what did any particular ones strike you as interesting, uncomfortable, inspiring, or just you can speak to the collection of them on the whole?
Yeah, I love that question, and like the way you formulated it as like interesting, uncomfortable, inspiring, and confusing it with animal friendly. Like those all are very relevant ways of characterizing them. So I think like interesting, what is interesting about them? I think what's interesting about them is that they exist. Like I think a lot of people are surprised. I have found this when you say that the Torah and the rabbis are interested in parent-child bonds among animals. Like people are just not aware that that's part of the Torah. And it's just super interesting that the Torah does care about those bonds. So I think they're interesting for just like being there in the Torah and wondering what they're doing there. I think I've talked a little bit about what's uncomfortable, and you kind of alluded to it in saying you get confused, is it animal family or animal friendly? And I think that is the problem, is that they're animal friendly from one angle, but not so animal friendly from another angle. And it's this whole question of like, is this about compassion? It kind of feels like maybe it is about empathy and compassion. But what does it mean to say these laws are about compassion and empathy when we're talking about slaughtering and cooking animals? It just seems weird and like it doesn't quite fit. So I think that's the piece that's uncomfortable and that actually really intrigued me about these laws, is like trying to figure out that paradox of like there seems to be some compassion. Yes, I get that. I understand why so many people have said that. But how do we square that with the fact that we're also separating the mother and child, slaughtering and cooking the mother and child? Um, and then I think in terms of, how are these laws inspiring? I would say I have actually found these laws to be really inspiring because they get us thinking about these bonds. Like I mean, I know somebody put into the chat that they used to be a rancher. They used to have, um, lives that were connected to animals. But I think, except for those of us who have, animal companions in our homes or who live lives that not like the one I live in New York City, we don't have a lot of relationships with animals. And so just having these laws kind of remind us of the fact that animal families exist And then on top of that, remind us of the ways we interfere with those families. I think that's very provocative and inspiring and gets us thinking about just the choices we make.
Yeah, you really tease out so beautifully how fraught the relationship is and the thinking about the relationship between humans and animals has been for centuries. And so that seems to be the continuing line is that we continue to feel like it's fraught and we continue to navigate it and negotiate it. And one of the things that you do so beautifully throughout the book, this is for like the animal science, biology folks in the room, but something that I really appreciated reading it is you integrate aspects of animal studies and biology and ethology, which is animal behavior, and animal archaeology into the conversation of how our ancestors encountered animals. So, can you talk about why that was important to your writing? And maybe you can give us an example.
Sure. So, drawing on animal science was definitely the most challenging part of this research. I didn't want to make assumptions about animal families. I wanted to actually understand what are the bonds, what are they like, how do they play out between animal parents and children in different species and different settings. And I really wanted to look at the best research on the subject that I could. Um, but if you're not a scientist and trained as a scientist, it's really hard to dip into scientific literature. It's just really specialized, really specific. But I found the key, and I asked scientists, and this is what they told me, and it was totally right, is really helpful to find literature reviews where somebody kind of pulls together all the literature and gives you an overview of all the different studies that have been done. So, just an example, I found one article. It's from the Journal of Dairy Science, which was that's what it's called. I wrote it down. A systematic review of the effects of early separation on dairy cow and calf health, and it was co-authored by a number of scientists. So instead of like one very specific study of one population and one aspect of the issue, I was able to get this kind of an overview of like what does happen when you separate a mother and calf, like what kind of effects does it have on their health. So the other scientific literature, I was really surprised this existed and totally fascinated by this, is that there have been studies on public attitudes towards cow-calf separation. And that was intriguing to me that they actually went out there and asked people, like they told people how it works in the animal agriculture industry, how that separation happens. And they asked lots of questions and got a sense of what people thought about it. And what they found is people were kind of upset about it when they heard about it. And a lot of people didn't actually know what happens to animal families in the industry. And that when they told people, this was the inspiring part for me, when they told people what happens, people said it changed their decision making about buying. In this case, it was dairy. So that was extra motivating for me, that when you tell people things, when you get people thinking about things, it can actually change people's minds and change what they do. And I would just add, like the archaeology was really important too, since the texts I'm dealing with, like the Bible and rabbinic literatures from antiquity. So if I'm trying to find out like, what was the reality of animal lives in antiquity, then you really have to rely. There's like an amazing field of archaeology called zooarchaeology, and they study animal bones, try to reconstruct the lives of animals in antiquity. That also is highly specialized, hard to dip into, but I did the best I could to try to understand what animal life was like for the biblical authors and for the rabbis.
Yeah, it really enriches the book so much more than just a purely textual analysis of what's going on in the different literature. Uh, and as someone who I feel like every few weeks reminds people that cows don't just spontaneously produce milk, I'm not surprised at all that people wouldn't necessarily know about what happens in the dairy industry in terms of cow-calf separation, because cows are mammals, and so they need to be pregnant to produce milk. But this is just not something, unless you're a farmer, not something you necessarily know unless you encounter it directly or someone tells you.
Yep.
Uh, Speaking of animal mothers, in the book you write the following about animal families in rabbinic literature. So this speaks to how well people had to know their herd, their animals, in order to do the things in the laws that they're bade to do. Anytime people wish to slaughter or sell an animal, they must first, according to the Mishnah, recall that animal's biography and family tree, asking themselves, who is this cow's mother? Who are her daughters? Who are her granddaughters? What's the significance of that relationship with one's herd? Like, how does that change the emotional connection or the consideration that humans had to have around their animals?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I I had like this epiphany moment with that particular law that you can't slaughter an animal, parent and child, on the same day. And it sounds like so stupid and obvious, but it like really hit me. I was like, oh, that means everybody had to know who their animal's parent and child was, like, and they had to know the family trees if they weren't going to violate this biblical law. So that just like changes the picture when people have to know these things. And I think what brought that home for me is a book about farming today. I was reading a book called Pastoral Song by an English farmer named James Rebanks. And it's a really beautiful book. He talks about the way his family's farm changed over the course of 3 generations, and how when he was with his grandfather as a kid, the livestock would go out and graze, and the area was like filled with all this wildlife. And then he takes us to the present day, and he's like horrified by all the changes that have taken place, which he doesn't like. And he tries to restore the farm to like the old ways. And one of the things he says is that when he was a kid and he was on the farm with his grandfather, that the animals, he said, they didn't sentimentalize the relationship. It wasn't like the cows or the sheep or their pets, but that the animals had backstories. And that word backstories kind of stuck with me, this idea that animals have backstories. And I kind of think it's true not just for animals, but just the idea that everybody, every animal, every person has a backstory is really important for how we live in the world, and keeps us from being total narcissists where the only story we think about is our own story, but just always being aware that other people have backstories. So I see this book as in a lot of ways about animal backstories and the Torah's laws and the rabbinic collaborations, kind of forcing us to acknowledge that animals have backstories. And, what we do with that, whether that increases our respect or changes the way we treat them, that's kind of the next set of questions. But I think it's just a really important starting point, this idea that animals have backstories.
I love that. And I have an anecdote to lead into my next question in relation to that piece about backstories, because it reminded me of I used to work with wild birds, like in wildlife rehab in California. And like the sheer delight of finding a bird whose band we knew because they had come in through the center before, and knowing like, oh my God, that means that they migrated and they probably reproduced and now they're back here, and like hopefully we'll be able to set them free again. But the idea that we had built a relationship with this animal And now it's back in our lives. And like we do know part of its backstory. And we're getting better at being able to track wildlife and getting to know what do they do when we don't see them. I think that's really powerful. And much to my delight, your book deals a lot with birds. So
Yeah.
so you spend a lot of time on birds, not just on the subject of Shiluach Haken, the sending away of the mother bird, but other pieces that relate to that parent-child relationship. And you talk about how bird families and support systems are very complex. So what is so significant and special about birds in our tradition, in our culture, and in relation to the animal family law?
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear more of your thoughts about that. But birds are really the outlier of the animal family laws. So it was a little hard for me to figure out where they fit in because the mother bird law is the only one that's not about mammals. It's the only one that's about wildlife. It's if you happen upon a bird. So it's not an animal that you own. And so it's really interesting to me that the Torah like went out of its way to worry about birds, specifically about mother birds. And it's kind of ironic to me too, because when I started reading about birds, there's father birds are actually unusual. I mean, it depends on the species, but are really pretty involved, like in unusual ways, like definitely compared to mammals, where fathers do actually recede. You have pretty active father bird, so it's ironic to me that the mother bird gets all the glory in the Torah. I think the father bird should get some too. But the mother bird law just really has spoken to Jews, I think, over the centuries in so many different ways. And I'm interested if other people have thoughts about this. Maybe it's because we interact more with birds than we do with other wildlife. We see them flying above us, or just things about birds that are so amazing, like the colors, the songs, um, their eyesight. Like there's just a lot of really cool feathers. Um, so yeah, and I think we see bird families more than we see other kinds of animal families. Like I'm in Brooklyn and I have a windowsill, and maybe every other year I end up with a pigeon nest on my windowsill, and I see the pigeons have their eggs and they're taking care of the babies. Um, I see them come out of their eggs as these cute little furry creatures. So, like, I actually get to see the making of an animal family on my windowsill in a way I do not see other animal families happening. So maybe that's part of it. And people actually, this is weird. This is something I did not expect to find when I started to research this mitzvah. Is you have a lot of people, I mean, I don't know the numbers, but people will pay someone to find them a bird's nest. I have videos I could show if we have extra time. They will pay money to be taken to a bird's nest to shoo the mother bird off the nest and then take the eggs. And a lot of times they'll just put the eggs right back in. But they actually think there's this like sort of good luck. Like I showed you that there is this promise of long life and prosperity if you shoo away the mother bird. Of course, I don't think the Torah meant you shoo away the mother bird if you're not interested in taking the eggs. Like they've kind of distorted the whole mitzvah, but there is this kind of magical quality that gets associated with birds. It's very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also was like only vaguely aware that that was a thing people did, and it kind of you speak to other ways in which the kind of loopholes and like the perceived opportunities of having relationships with animals in certain ways gets like kind of distorted and exploited in certain ways in modern
Yeah,
times. It's like
yeah.
that's not what they meant. Um, but yeah, I appreciated your anecdote about the pigeons. I'm wearing my pigeon earrings. They're very small, you can't see them, but yay for yay for pigeons. I'm wearing them in honor of this talk. And you alluded to this a little bit, but do you want to talk a little more about the privileging of the mother-child relationship versus the father-child relationship? I think, as you said, it's quite significantly shared, especially in bird life. I think you only have to go to like the wildlife cams to see the bald eagles that often get highlighted during brooding and nesting season, where like you see the parents switching off equally to go back and forth from the nest, and yet the rabbis really had this favoring of the mother-child relationship. And this comes up too in the subject of animal orphans. So maybe you can speak a little more to that.
Yeah, I was actually really worried about that, like kind of the whole time when I was working on this project, is that it would seem like kind of retrograde, like it was all about mommy, you know, and kind of like holding up the mother as this parent figure, that these laws in the way they prioritize the mother would lend themselves to like a nostalgia about a certain kind of motherhood. And I thought about that, you know, like every day and working on this. And here's what I realized that made me feel a little less worried about this issue is one, that one of the animal family laws may actually be about fathers, although people read it different ways. That's the one where it's masculine grammar and it talks about not slaughtering the parent and child on the same day. So we may actually have animal fathers there. And then here's what I realized is that the focus on the mother is really just a product of our own domestication priorities. Like, and that's true today, and it was true then. And we're not used to males being at the bottom of the hierarchy. But that is the case with domesticated animals, is males just are not valued in the same way as females, especially when it comes to mammals, is they don't produce milk and they don't produce babies. And a lot of times they'll just kill a baby male because it's like not worth it to raise that male animal unless it's going to be the male who gives like the semen for the herd. But aside from that, like it's sort of like a flip where it's like all they want the males for are their semen. And you know, if they're not going to be, or it's strength, like they'll keep like one ox or one big animal for strength to travel or for work, like for threshing the fields. But aside from that, it's really the female animals that are wanted. So I think this focus on the mother is not because in nature, I mean, I do think in mammals, female animals have a certain unique role to play. I tried to do some reading about mammal dads and what kind of roles they play. And if anybody here is a biologist, I'd love to hear more about that. It sounds like it's more complicated than just that mammal dads, you know, don't care about the kids. But the reason that the laws around domesticated animals focus on moms is really about the ruthlessness of our own practices with domesticated animals, that what we care about is the moms. So I don't think there's any nostalgia here. I think this is actually something that needs to be critiqued, is that focus on the mom for economic reasons. Um, yeah, and I guess the final thing I'd say is it's super interesting that the one place where in Jewish law, I think, or one of the few places in Jewish law where we prioritize the female is in genealogy, in the matrilineal principle. And scholars have argued that that's actually based on our laws about animals because we prioritize animal mothers and we extended that to our thinking about humans in this one area. So I think that to me speaks to all the parallel ways sometimes we do think about humans and animals, that there's so many that that we can't just kind of put to the side how we think about animals, because it actually does shape the way we think about humans.
I think that was such a mind-blowing insight into in your book that I certainly hadn't thought about before, how we mirror some of that privileging of the lineage based on animals themselves. And later in the book, I don't want to give too much away because it's such a good section, but you talk about Talmudic tall tales, some of which portray big, angry birds, and some of which depict a dystopia, almost like a revenge fantasy of the animals, where the animals turn on humans. And it reminded me of the more contemporary versions we have of this through different comic strips and other art forms, the premise of Planet of the Apes, where suddenly we're not living in this anthropocentric world. So what do you think is going on there? Why did the rabbis feel compelled to imagine these alternate realities and stories?
That's a really cool question. And what it makes me think is that I think we actually want to break out of our anthropocentrism. I think our anthropocentrism weighs us down, and that in these fantasies, it's our way of like breaking out. And I think breaking out of like human narcissism actually makes us feel really good, and it helps us exercise our imagination and envision alternative realities. So I think it suggests that deep inside of us, we actually don't like our anthropocentrism, and it is a bit of a cage we put ourselves in. But yeah, so I don't know how many people here are familiar with Talmudic stories. They can get really, really crazy, um, really interesting. I think you could almost look at them as kind of this subconscious sort of exploding to the surface. And when I was looking to see what kind of commentary the rabbis have about the law where you have to keep an animal with the mother for the first 7 days, I found so little commentary on this. I can't tell you why. But what comes up a lot where you'd expect commentary on that is discussion of animal orphans. Clearly, the rabbis were concerned about vulnerable animal children, what happens to them when you kill the parents. And in the context of talking about that, they just started telling these stories about this like faraway place. It's called Arkat Levena. I don't know if it's real or not, but there's stories about like giant birds like dropping their eggs down and killing all the people and everything in 60 cities. It's like, really out there kind of stuff. But yeah, as Rabbi Hoffman said, like there's different, it's hard to know how to read these kinds of things, but I read it as a kind of like revenge fantasy where animals are kind of turning on humans, and they're much bigger and they're destructive, and they're the ones running the show, not us.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of the book. Um, and we're going to wrap up with just a last question, then get to a couple of questions that were submitted. But we obviously want to know how animal families teach us to be and act in the Jewish community today. This does speak a little bit to what we wrote in the epilogue, which I was very, very honored to be included in. So, what are some of the key things that Jewish and all communities can do to protect animal families?
Yeah, so I may punt some of that question over to you because I think you're better at answering it than I am. But I'm just going to tell a little story. So this past Shabbat, I was at a kiddush. Went to a bat mitzvah. Was at a kiddush, and somehow I ended up telling. I think the person I was talking to offered me some food. It wasn't vegan, and I mentioned I was vegan, and the person was genuinely curious, like, "Well, why are you vegan?" And so I think I give different answers each time I get asked that question. But this time, for whatever reason, I said, well, actually, I'm vegan for feminist reasons. And this person I was talking to was totally flummoxed by that answer. They were like, what does veganism have to do with feminism? And I said, well, dairy and eggs are the products of female bodies. It's animal bodies, but it's female bodies. And so, we are using the reproductive capacities of female bodies. Um, so if I'm gonna care about that stuff when it comes to humans, like it kind of makes sense to me to care about it when it comes to animals. So I think when you think about animal family bonds, you start to run into questions about your food norms. And I would just say for me, it's not a sacrifice. I really feel like a happier person knowing that there's not like some mom out there whose milk I took and whose baby like didn't get that milk because of me. Um, but the final thing, I always like to kind of finish off with this thought. I think the whole vegan discourse can just be very guilt inducing, like, oh, you're a bad person if you're not vegan and you're not making the right choices. But what I want to underline is I think how much pleasure and joy comes from connecting to animal families. Um, and I think the Torah connected to that. I think these laws connect us to that. If you're interested in seeing it a little more directly in Tanakh, Job 39 is an amazing chapter to look at because it just celebrates like the beauty and wonder of animal families and kind of the whole cosmos. So I think there's a lot. It's not just about guilt and feeling bad. I think there's just a lot of pleasure and joy in thinking more about animal families. And in terms of like practical advice, Melissa, do you want to talk about one or two things that we talked about in our epilogue?
Yeah, so we broke down the epilogue into a few different sections of kind of, I mean, they're artificial categories, but they do reflect, I think, ways that we tend to categorize animals. So we did break it down in terms of what we can do to protect animal families in the context of wild habitats, captive circumstances, in the food system, as companion animals. And hopefully, some of what Beth's work helps us do is understand that those animals are treated the way they're treated in those contexts because we have categorized them as such. And yet they still have these incredibly complex social emotional lives. And as CJFE, I will just plug that one of the things that we try to normalize in communities is the aspect of normalizing a more plant-based default where we can opt to serve fewer animals so that we can help all of them thrive, both in the food system and outside the food system, lessening our reliance on the places where they're farmed most industrially, most intensively, is one of the best things we can do. So I will say that as a teaser, because you'll all go out and get the book somehow and read it. Speaking of which, Beth, before we get to our last couple of comments, where can we get your book?
Yeah, sure. So I think you said that the Center for Jewish Food Ethics has a bookshop affiliate link. So there's that. Um, I'm a big fan of bookshop.org, which brings together independent bookstores. My husband is a novelist. He hates Amazon more than anything else in the entire world for what it's done to book publishing. So don't buy it on Amazon. Bookshop.org is great. You could ask your library. Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, Kayla will go ahead and paste that link in the chat. Thank you to possibly a couple of you who have already ordered the book from Bookshop. We appreciate it. It supports our organization to buy it from our link. And of course, ask your library to carry it. Looks like this. And there will be a link to it in the chat shortly. We have a couple of comments in the chat. Beth, you might just quickly make sure that there weren't any individual chats to you as well. But this is from Rachel, who says, like you, birds nest on our house. I feel a sense of perhaps grace that they choose our house. So we aren't just watching birds from afar in the sky flying overhead. They choose to lay eggs and raise their chicks until they can fly at our house. So I wonder if the authors of the Torah felt this sense of grace about them to include them in the rules of treating animals with kindness. And maybe
That makes a lot of sense to me. I know. I mean, we're obviously different from the people who lived then, but you have to imagine there are some continuities between humans now and humans then. And I know my own experience when pigeons nest on my windowsill it's just awesome watching them build their nest and lay their eggs and keep them warm. It's a really miraculous thing to watch. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if that experience is somewhere embedded in this law.
And then we also had a question submitted with regards to animals as companions and being part of our families. And someone kind of wanted to just like get any insight that you glean from the animal family laws. Like today, we clearly treat companion animals as almost members of our family to the extent that when they pass away, we mourn them as a family member. So, what, if anything, does that have to do with the way that our rabbis have set us up to understand animal families, and how has it changed today?
Yeah, no, I have a dog, so I totally relate to that question. And my dog is definitely part of my family. It runs the gamut from amazing experiences with him to where he drives us crazy, and like all the complexity of family dynamics is there. And I would just say that for me, this book was really about moving away from that model of humans like absorbing animals into our own families and trying to appreciate a little bit more the relationships that animals have with each other. Like something that's been really important to me is making sure that my dog gets a lot of social time with other dogs. And um and i i feel all the time a kind of like my heart sinks when I think about how we separated him, but like he didn't get the opportunity to be with his family, and who knows, like maybe those bonds wouldn't have lasted. I think there's, that's science. Like, how long do those bonds last? What do they mean to the animals? I don't want to sentimentalize, his relationship with, his mom. I think so. But I tried to, I think with the whole pet model or companion animal model, I think that I think for me it's really important to respect the unique needs of animals and not anthropomorphize too much. And like one of my pet peeves is and I'm sorry if somebody here does it, I really don't like when people like dress up animals in costumes and things like that. I think it's like humiliating to them.
I think this actually speaks. There's one last question that we'll pose, and I think it speaks to the anthropomorphizing, which I think as people who care about animals, like we're always kind of second guessing, are we doing this and are we doing it with the animals who depend on our care? Could the sole attention to mother birds in Torah be an attempt to relate best to them, as we recognize they aren't mammals, but we might not have known enough about them to make other judgments?
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much to be said about bird families and what we do know and what the rabbis knew or what the biblical authors knew. Because, as you mentioned before, Melissa, animal animal communities or the raising of birds, like specifically with birds, is so complex. You have helper birds at the nest. I mean, and that was really one of the ways I felt like looking at animal families is not retrograde at all, because animal families are as complex, if not more, than human families. You have, birds slipping their eggs into other nests, and it's basically foster parenting in bird families. So I'm very curious, like how much ancient people knew about these bracts. I bet they knew because, like, you can look in a nest and see one of those eggs doesn't look like the others, so they probably had a sense of the complexity of those families.
Yeah, the fact that rabbis knew about the bird species who trick other birds into raising their young is like, that could be its own book, right?
Right.
Well, I know we're at time, so I do want to let people go on time. I want to thank you so much, Professor Berkowitz, Beth, for being here with us today and for producing this amazing work. I hope you all get a chance to read it. Please be in touch with us if you would like to find out more about CJFE. You can also find out more at our website at jewishfoodethics.org. And we hope you join us for more programs. And in the meantime, go out and get Beth's book and an early Chag Sameach, wishing you a very meaningful Pesach, Passover next week.
Thanks so much. This was great. Thank you so much.